Hello, how are you? I'm not feeling too hot. I have tonsillitis and I've been wanting to do this video for the last 3 days. But for the last 3 days I've essentially been mute. So today's the first day that I can actually communicate. Don't know why I'm doing this with my hands. So that's the reason why I'm turning on the camera, even though every cell in my body is telling me not to. So before we begin, you have no idea how difficult it has been to make sure that I'm centre. And even now, I'm not totally convinced. Let's move on. So before I do start properly, I feel the need to put up a little disclaimer and just highlight that I am on a lot of flu and cough medicine, and in addition to that I am on antibiotics, so I will try and be as coherent as I possibly can, but I make no promises. None whatsoever. So let's start the story. Let's tell you the story where I almost very nearly died. Hashtag not really, but kind of. So I got into London Gatwick at like, I think it was about 7, 8 o'clock. Put my bag through, very much looking forward to going to Canada, not really being able to communicate. Don't really know what I'm doing this with my hands, but I'm gonna keep on doing it. And I boarded the plane. Oh goodness. I boarded the plane around 12 and everything was fine. It was actually really peculiar because just before I boarded, see, I'm not being coherent, but I'm just going to go along with it. Just before I boarded, I remember thinking to myself, I don't feel really good about this. So much so, and I rarely do this, but I actually called up my mum and my dad just to say, like, I love you. I'll speak to her on the other side, which I rarely do. My dad didn't pick up, obviously, but my mum did. But I didn't communicate my concerns with my mum because it was all up in my head anyway, and there was no point in worrying my mum. But yeah, I just remember thinking, I don't know, I'm not feeling too good about this. And I think it was partly because I was flying over the Atlantic. So yes, I've flown over the Atlantic before, but I just don't like flying in that direction. And I think in fact I know why. So I always think that if you're going to have a problem up in the sky, you might as well have a problem up in the sky where you can safely land on land. So if you're flying over the Atlantic, there's very few places that you can land other than the sea. And the idea of just having an emergency stop, like, and then having to drop down in the Atlantic, which is incredibly cold and isolated, it concerns me. So maybe that was in the forefront of my mind, and it wasn't helpful, but it was. Anyway, so I boarded the plane and I put on my little seatbelt and the camera stopped working, so I'm hoping that it will just be fine now. Yeah, so the plane moved and it moved to the back of the runway, and all of a sudden it started moving at a really fast speed. I had loads of leg room, and I had the air hostess who was literally like there, like she was right in front of me. And when we were going at a fast speed to, you know, like take off, there was 3 distinct bumps where the aircraft like juddered. Great dance move. And I remember looking at her for a sense of reassurance because I'd never felt that before. And the 3 bumps, they were evenly spaced. So it made me think in the moment that there was something wrong with the wheel, But I looked at her for reassurance. She looked at me, she smiled, told me that everything was great with her eyes. So yeah, there was no need for me to worry. And then we started to take off, and when we took off, we must have been like 10 foot off the ground, if that. And then all of a sudden the wings, so you know on the wings the flaps, I don't know if you call them flaps is such a gross word, but you know, like the flaps like came up, and then the plane like almost immediately landed, and then the flaps stayed up to, you know, of course, like create some friction to ensure that like the plane stopped. There's a lot of hand movements here, isn't there? And it helps just to be able to communicate it. And yeah, and then we stopped. So I was perplexed, didn't know what was happening. And then we saw smoke heading from like the right side of the plane. I was thankfully on the left-hand side. The captain, he said that there was a problem with the right engine and it's going to be looked at so we can, you know, get to our destination as soon as possible. And then all of a sudden we had like 3 fire engines like follow us and an ambulance. So it was all very real. And whilst I don't mind flying by myself, I think at that right moment I would have quite liked or quite appreciated having someone that I could communicate to. And whilst I was able to communicate quite extensively with the air hostess, it just wasn't the same. So yeah, we were instructed to get off the plane, and we were all given a food voucher, to which I spent it at Wagamama's. Of course I did. I'd never been in a situation like that before. I certainly hadn't had an emergency landing before. I've had moments in aircrafts that have been quite tricky, where I have ended up praying, despite the fact that I consider myself to be an atheist. But I needed all the help in the world in some of the situations that I've been in. But I've never been in a situation where it's emergency landed. And I'm not afraid to admit this, but I was terrified. Maybe terrified is a bit strong, but I was scared. I was worried. Anyway, so I had some food. We were instructed to go back to the aircraft, and we had to go to seating area 13, which I don't think was actually very well thought out, because after everybody had just experienced, you know, an emergency landing, and I'm not particularly superstitious, but even still, like, that's not okay. So as far as everyone was concerned at that point, is that, you know, they'd fixed the problem, we were flying over, everything was going to be grand. So we got there and we actually were told that we couldn't fly, and they were rearranging the flight for the following day. So I'm not sure whether you remember, but in case you don't, I was only ever going to be in Canada for 3 days. And whilst that is a little bit mental, I was really looking forward to my trip, and I was going because I hadn't seen Noemi for 3 years, longer, and I was going because it allowed me to utilise the bank holiday. Anyway, by them changing the date by a day, it essentially meant that I would only be in Canada for like a day and a half. And whilst I consider myself to be up for anything, that was just a step too far. I'm gonna go because I feel like I need to sleep again, but look after yourself. Make sure you wear a seatbelt, man. Like, it's so important. And I will speak to you later.